Did you know that AIDS was originally known as GRID, gay-related immune deficiency? The name was quickly changed to the more politically correct term AIDS, or acquired immune deficiency syndrome. But the fact remains that the AIDS epidemic was originally the result of abominations committed by homosexuals, or what the Bible calls sodomites. The media has convinced most Americans that homosexuality is a harmless, alternative lifestyle, but nothing could be further from the truth, and this film will prove it.
Hey everyone, I am Firewalker, and today I want to take a look at the documentary posted by Pastor Steve Anderson of Arizona on whether or not AIDS is the judgment of God, specifically on the homosexual community. And I've already done one video, a rant actually, about his sermon on the subject, the link to which is posted in the description. The target audience for that is not those who are Christian, not those who believe what this guy is saying. It's purely a rant. So take that into consideration should you watch it. And this documentary essentially is just the pastor's sermon mixed in with anti-gay propaganda from like the 80s. Regardless, I think it is worth taking a look at, if for no other reason than because it can be very educational. At least not the video, but I mean the parts that I'm gonna add in. It's educational for me to look at things, look it up and do research on it. But no, the video itself is not in the least educational. Before we get started though, if you do believe in Christianity, if you do believe what this pastor is saying about AIDS, the judgment of God, I have to ask you though, do you really want to prove this? Do you really want to go here? If not, stop the video now, because you may not like where it leads. This series is going to be in a few different parts because the documentary I should say the propaganda video is an hour long total, so I'm going to break it down. And to kick it off, he's made his introduction now. I'm going to take a look at what would need to be proved in order to then prove that AIDS is the judgment of God on the homosexual community. Keeping in mind, though, that the last sentence of his introduction states that they're going to prove that homosexuality is a bad lifestyle altogether, not just that AIDS is the judgment of God. Furthermore, we should probably go over some definitions. I should say he, making his case, should have gone over some definitions, and then a little more specific about whether he's talking about HIV and AIDS or just AIDS. Because while HIV is a virus that you need to get in order to get AIDS, not everybody with HIV does get AIDS. That would have been worth mentioning, but I can't put words into his mouth, so I will let that continue. I'd also like to see some evidence as to how AIDS came to be from homosexual sex, considering that none of the theories or evidence that I've seen in researching this has anything to do with homosexual sex at all. And this is in the introduction, so evidence should be in the rest of the video, but I have yet to come across it. So we'll circle around back to that issue, but first let's take a look at what would need to be proved in order to prove that AIDS is the judgment of God on the homosexual community. These first four things here, I'm not going to expect the propaganda video to cover, considering that its target audience is going to be people who are already Christians. So number one, though, would be that a God exists at all. Number two, that your particular God exists. Number three, that it is within its power to do such a thing. 4, it is within his nature to do such a thing. And what we're really going to focus on here is 5 and 6. 5 being that gay sex is the lowest common denominator, i.e. it has the strongest correlation to AIDS, and that might suggest a causation. And 6 is that you're still going to have to pass Occam's razor and prove to me that it is more likely that God is doing this versus just a random act of nature. Good luck with that.
Scientists at the National Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta today released the results of a study which shows that the lifestyle of some male homosexuals has triggered an epidemic of a rare form of cancer. Robert Bazell now in Atlanta.
Bobby Campbell of San Francisco and Billy Walker of New York both suffer from a mysterious, newly discovered disease which affects mostly homosexual men. Researchers know of 413 people who have contracted the condition in the past year. 1/3 have died and none have been cured. Investigators have examined the habits of homosexuals for clues.
San Francisco has more cases of AIDS per capita than any other city. The number of new victims, almost all of them homosexual men.
Fully half of San Francisco's 80,000 gay men already may carry the AIDS antibody. Since 1981, there have been 1,400 AIDS deaths here.
Studies show that about half the gay men in San Francisco are infected with the AIDS virus, HIV.
While gays were gaining in the courts and legislatures, a new disease was diminishing their numbers. AIDS, still incurable, still pervasive among homosexuals. This month, the total number of Americans killed by AIDS will top the number of Americans killed in Vietnam.
We come to thank God for the life of Phil Howard, for all that he meant to all of you.
San Francisco's gay community, once the capital of gay liberation, has become a community of young men who spend much of their time dealing with death and dying.
Lord, have mercy.
Many people compare the experience of living through the AIDS epidemic to war. In this city alone, AIDS already has killed more than 5,000 people. That is 3 times the number of people from San Francisco who died fighting in all the wars in this century.
You feel very helpless. There's absolutely nothing you can do.
Bob Ross publishes a gay newspaper called the Bay Area Reporter. Every week he prints obituaries of at least a dozen people in the area who died of AIDS.
And I'm going to have to stop this right there because this is the closest thing we're going to get to discussing the origin of HIV and AIDS. Clearly this clip from the news is from approximately the 70s because this is when we knew so little about HIV or AIDS that this guy is calling it cancer, which it is not. It is an autoimmune disease. Also, this is covering some of the first cases that we in the U.S. found, and that was members of the gay community. They were homosexual men. This is not where HIV or AIDS started any more than this is where Ebola started, or the scarlet fever, or syphilis. None of these actually came to be here. And I don't really understand why people would think that this, because this is where the Americans first started noticing things were wrong, especially considering that it's not like HIV or AIDS is a particularly obvious disease. There are no outward signs. Nothing is rotting and falling off of your body. You're not looking like a zombie. There's really nothing that distinguishes people with HIV and AIDS from the other population simply from outward appearance. And you're not even actually going to die of AIDS. You would die of whatever other illness you get because your immune system is down and can't fight off anything at all. So tracing back to the origin of HIV and AIDS is extremely difficult and an inexact science. We can get in a range, we can get in a ballpark, but we can't pin it down to a specific individual where everything started. In the latter part of the 90s, some scientists were able to track back specific strains of HIV to specific species of monkeys in Africa. And the going theory is that it jumped species probably from eating the meat of monkeys who had HIV and AIDS. And then from there are a lot of factors into the spread of HIV and AIDS, and it is not simply homosexual sex. Of course, children can be born with HIV or AIDS because their mother had HIV or AIDS. Heterosexual sex can spread it just as easily, and there's also, of course, needles or injections, anything that involves the swap of bodily fluids, essentially. And around this time, of course, we, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we were sent a lot of aid over to Africa, medical aid, thinking that we were, of course, doing a good thing, but we didn't have enough needles. And so there was a lot of sharing needles with or without sterilization, and that led to a pretty big, a significant boom in the spread of HIV and AIDS. Blood transfusions for people whose blood cannot clot also led to a great deal of spread of HIV and AIDS. And then, like I said, the fact that you can't really see when you get the disease, and a bunch of people don't even know they have it now, makes it a lot easier to spread it as well, because you don't know you have it. So you may not be avoiding activities or blood banks, for instance, that can aid in the spread of it. International travel makes a big difference as far as it leaving countries. And as best as we can figure, it went from Africa to Haiti to the U.S. So there we have it. A better look at the origin of AIDS. Just because the first cases that we noticed in the U.S. were from gay males does not mean that that's where it originated. In fact, it doesn't appear to be at all where it originated. One other question, though. When it talks about the numbers of people of the gay community who have HIV or AIDS, here in this news segment at least, is it that God hates any group of people with AIDS, or is it just the groups that are more affected by it than yours? Are all diseases and illnesses God's wrath? Like diabetes, scarlet fever, the Black Plague, strep throat, sickle cell, cancer, chickenpox, colds, etc. Are all of these God's judgment, or just the ones that fit your agenda? And how can we tell the difference between the ones that are or are not God's judgment?
AIDS is the judgment of God. And that's the title of the sermon tonight, AIDS, the judgment of God. You say, well, I don't think God would send that judgment. Well, go back, if you would, to Deuteronomy chapter 28. In fact, God already said repeatedly throughout the Bible that disease or pestilence is a judgment that he would send. The Bible used the word pestilence. We would normally use the word disease. It's the same thing. It's germs. It's disease. It's something that's infected. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 19. Let me just explain to you what Deuteronomy 28 is. It's a list of the curses upon those who would disobey the Lord.
But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. The Lord shall make the pestilence cleave unto thee until he have consumed thee from off the land whither thou goest to possess it. The Lord shall smite thee with a consumption, and with a fever, and with an inflammation, and with an extreme burning, and with the sword, and with blasting, and with mildew, and it shall pursue thee until thou perish. The Lord will smite thee with the botch of Egypt, and with the emerods, and with the scab, and with the itch, wherewith thou canst not be healed.
I would like to point out that most of those things on the list we have medications for now, which brings me to the next question, which is, considering that we now have medications that would allow someone with HIV or AIDS to essentially live a normal, happy life, does that mean we have outsmarted God? Also, does the fact that only 37% of the people with HIV or AIDS have access to this medication mean that he loves them more than he loves the 63% that don't? Does that in turn mean that God loves the wealthy more than he loves the poor, because they're the ones who can't afford the health care needed to live with and survive AIDS? What does this say about your God?
AIDS is not God's vengeance upon the homosexual community.
Don't tell me that God won't send disease. Don't tell me that God won't send pestilence as a punishment. Don't tell me that the fact that our country today is filled with STDs isn't the judgment of God today, because it is. And you say, well, that has nothing to do with it. That's baloney. You know and I know that married, heterosexual, normal Christian people are not picking up these diseases. They're just not doing it.
See, and this is one of the instances where it would be really great to know whether he's talking about HIV and AIDS or just AIDS. This figure here is from the CDC, and it shows the estimated number of new HIV infections in 2010 in the U.S. alone, based on the most at-risk groups. And here, this shows 11,600 people who are not gay men getting HIV. Furthermore, an organization called AVERT reports that there are approximately 1.1 million people in the world with HIV or AIDS, 65% of which are homosexual males, leaving 35% to be non-homosexual males, which would be approximately 385,000 people. But of course, I'm sure that's somewhere close to none if you turn your head and squint at it and maybe have drunk a lot before then. But sure, none.
Unless they get a blood transfusion from one of these freaks, they're not going to get it. You get it from being promiscuous. You get it from living a life of sin, my friend. And anybody who's being honest with you would tell you that. Now go back to Romans chapter 1.
Actually, you could get it from a blood transfusion from anybody with HIV or AIDS, not just members of the LGBT plus community. You could also get it by being born with it, of course, or possibly even eating the meat of monkeys with HIV or AIDS, as is the theory for how it jumped species from the monkeys to humans. But let's just disregard that, and let's just go ahead and focus on that you said we get from being promiscuous, from leading a life of sin. So it's actually promiscuity that is the risk factor, not being gay. Is that what you're saying? Because having more sexual partners does increase the risk for getting HIV or AIDS, just like driving more frequently increases your risk for getting an automobile accident. A hell of a lot more than, say, being out in the middle of the ocean on a boat. A lot harder to get in a car accident there. So yes, that does increase your risk. And this is where he's starting to chip away at what he's saying and backpedaling a little bit. Like, yeah, you get it from being gay, but also, I mean, from getting a blood transfusion, or from being just promiscuous in general. Well, you know what, just say what you mean, man. And this tells me that this is just propaganda. This is just for the agenda. This has nothing to do with how one actually gets HIV or AIDS.
It's clear.
For this cause, God gave them up unto vile affections. For even their women did change their natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust one toward another. Men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat.
Now, I have my Bible here. This is a possession that I really prize. This is my grandma's New Testament. In Romans chapter 1, my sweet old grandmother, right under the part where it says, receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat, she wrote the word AIDS. That's what Grandma said. She said, receiving in themselves that recompense, or what they deserve, or the judgment or punishment that they've earned, receiving in themselves that recompense of the error which was meat, she wrote AIDS. This is from the Center for Disease Control. Here's what they say, that the AIDS rate, the rate of HIV, is 50 times higher for homosexuals. Did you hear that? 50 times higher. Okay, now, you say, well, that's odd. I wonder how in the world this normal, natural, healthy, wonderful lifestyle would lead to 50 times as much of this deadly disease.
I haven't actually been able to find this statistic on the CDC website myself through multiple Google searches, so if anyone comes across that, if you could send it my way, that'd be very much appreciated, because all he says is that the CDC said it. I can't find where the CDC said it. I would also be curious if anybody who can math, which would not be me, if you could run the numbers and figure out how much more likely someone is to get HIV or AIDS if you're in a third world country versus somewhere with decent healthcare like the US or halfway decent healthcare like the US, or if you're below poverty lines versus above poverty lines in the US, or whether you're African American versus Caucasian, or so many other things. There's so many different groups that are disproportionately affected than others. So I'd like to compare all of these just to see what they might show. Also, this again brings up the question of, is it the sheer numbers that say who God hates more? Because that also brings up some very unpleasant things. For instance, apparently God hates the Bible Belt more than the rest of the U.S. Incidentally, that's also the area most likely to teach abstinence-only sex education, or no sex education, as was the case at my school. Apparently, he also hates the African American community more than the Caucasian and Hispanic communities. Men also more than women, at least in 2010, according to the CDC. Who knows? He could have changed his mind by then. He is more likely to hate you if your household makes less than $50,000 a year, which means that you have less access to health care, less access to education. And here we see a comparison of wealth and race and what a difference it makes. You are much more likely to get HIV or AIDS if you are below the poverty line in the U.S. So if we're going by sheer numbers and which groups are disproportionately affected, then again, I'd have to ask you, what does this say about your God?
Okay, well, let me explain to you how they got 50 times as much AIDS, because it's right here in this article, which is a scientific article put out by two researchers, Bell and Weinberg, and they did a study of thousands and thousands of homos, just doing a study on their lifestyle, doing a survey, and here's what they found. They found that 28% of homos that they checked with, 28% had already had more than 1,000 partners. Now look, it's hard to even wrap your mind around a number like that, isn't it? 1,000. I mean, there's only 365 days in a year. I mean, just something. 1,000 different people. 28%. That's almost a third. Let's just round it down. Let's just call it a fourth. That means that if you know 4 homos, one of them has already surpassed the 1,000 mark based on this information.
And yet, I still can't say that any member of the LGBT plus community that I personally know has had that many sexual partners. So, I don't know about that study. Furthermore, yes, if you have more sexual partners, you are more likely to be exposed to STIs, STDs, HIV and AIDS, etc. Just like if you drive more, you're more likely to be in a car accident. So what you're telling me is that it's not actually being gay that's causing the problem. No, it is having too many sexual partners. That is actually the risk factor here. That's what you're telling me. The lowest common denominator is not being gay. It is not being a member of the LGBT plus community. It is being exposed more to HIV and AIDS. That's the actual risk factor here, which would further support that if AIDS is a judgment of God, it means that he hates those in third world countries more than first world countries. He hates those of African descent more than he does Caucasians, and he hates those of Hispanic or Latina descent more than he does Caucasians. He hates men more than he does women. He hates the poor more than he does the rich. And the common denominator is simply how frequently you are exposed to HIV or AIDS, and whether or not you have the means and the resources to get the medications that you need in order to continue living a happy and healthy life.
Now, look, do you think I made this up? Go research it. It's all fact. And then there are about 3 other studies that were done that showed the same thing. So, I mean, this was studied in different parts of the country, different time periods. One was done in the 70s, one was done in the 90s, and more than a quarter, more than 1 out of 4 had 1,000, already 1,000. I mean, that number boggles the mind. 28%. But it goes further than that. 43% over 500. And that's already just bizarre. I mean, just off the charts. I mean, so if you know 2 of them, 1 of them has hit the 500 mark already. How is that even possible, Pastor Anderson? Well, that's because 79% of homos said that more than half of their partners are complete strangers. 79% said that more than half of their partners are complete strangers.
Oh, so now you're telling me it's having sexual relations with somebody you don't know and who's not earned your trust is the risk factor. It's not being gay, but not knowing people you sleep with. You've really got to make up your mind.
Now, do you understand why they're 50 times more likely to have AIDS? Not only that, but a mere 17% reported having less than 50 already. And I mean, look, they still have their whole life ahead of them. 17%, a mere 17% said, at this point, I've had less than 50. Only 17%. And this study showed that being monogamous or being faithful to one partner was non-existent.
And again, my personal experience is going to have to go against what the statistics you're citing say they should be. So as far as non-existent goes, it's pretty existent to not exist. It's funny how that works.
Homosexuality is a sin.
It was California Republican William Dannemeyer who recently declared on the House floor God's plan for man was Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve.
Oh, so this is the asshole that coined that phrase. I do actually feel a lot better knowing that. But this would be a great time to go ahead and take a look at the Bible's role in all of this, since Christians and this guy is clearly going to be using this AIDS is the judgment of God as proof somehow that marriage should be one man and one woman. But as far as the Bible goes, show me the verse where it says one woman. Because I don't remember ever seeing it or ever even hearing of it. I've just been told that somehow the Bible says that. But I do, however, remember stories of polygamy. I remember that Sarah gave Abraham her slave to have a kid with. And I remember God getting upset that they weren't trusting him to provide the child and took matters into their own hands. But I don't remember him ever condemning them for, or Abraham specifically, for having more than one sexual partner. I remember that Jacob married both Leah and Rachel, and I don't remember that being an issue in particular, although he was an asshole. I remember David had multiple wives. I remember Solomon had multiple wives and concubines. But never did I hear any of them being condemned for having multiple sexual partners. So if anyone would like to show me the verse where it says one woman, that would be very helpful. Oh, it would be worth pointing out, though, that in some versions of Genesis, Lilith was actually the first woman, but that didn't work out, so then God created Eve.
Dannemeyer leads a group of conservative Republicans who hope to make AIDS a political issue. They meet to plan strategy for bringing controversial AIDS-related legislation to the House floor.
At some point, the public is going to demand action, frankly, to get on with protecting the public health.
Bathhouses frequented by homosexual men. The House already has voted overwhelmingly to close them if federal authorities believe they help spread AIDS. In New York City, a Republican campaign proposal to close all businesses that cater mainly to homosexual men.
Gay bathhouses, blamed for encouraging high-risk sex, were shut down by the city a year ago, but most had already closed for lack of customers.
The baths were ordered closed when city inspectors found evidence of sexual practices which they felt led to the spread of AIDS. Owners of 5 of the bathhouses plan to fight the order in court.
Congressman Dannemeyer charges that Democrats won't be tough enough on AIDS because he says the party fears alienating homosexual voters.
They have opened up their party to the male homosexual community in America. And those members of Congress or state legislature or county government who don't take those actions that are needed are going to pay the political price for not having done so.
I think it is one more instance of fag bashing.
Last weekend, Daryl Yates' wrist predicted that the mine shaft would close. He had started going to the gay backroom bar 10 years ago. But Saturday night, Rist went as a journalist, the last stop on a tour he had taken of city gay bathhouses.
None of these clubs wants their clientele to die, and no gay man in this city wants to die, nor does he want his friends and lovers to die.
But the mine shaft's neighbors, the meat packers, don't believe Rist. They say they believe what they see.
They're making love in the street on top of cars and everything. This is men, grown men. I mean, that's not normal.
We've seen it all since we've been here. They try to pick us up. They come out drunk.
Sometimes in the morning you see needles on the floor here, and we have to work around it. This is government meat inspected places here.
And here they're going to paint a picture to elicit some sort of emotional reaction to cause you to dislike the group as a whole based on the actions of a few. This would be pretty much the same thing as saying that all Christians are evil and hateful and cruel and heartless and psychopathic, etc., based on what Pastor Steve Anderson says and based on the Westboro Baptist Church protesters. This would be like saying that Islam itself is evil simply because of 9/11 and ISIS. Since when has making broad, sweeping generalizations ever been a good argument?
The meat handlers say it's gone on too long. Mayor Koch agrees in light of the AIDS crisis.
This is a matter that involves a lot of money to these people. They are selling death. Places where death can be distributed. We don't want that to go on. But nevertheless, they don't give a damn about it, apparently, because it's going on, and they're making money.
They're doing is abnormal in the sense that most of these people, they're not fit, they're not human beings, they have emotional problems.
And I'm going to cut off part 1 with the man saying they are not human beings. They have emotional problems. I'm just going to go ahead and let that one sit. In the meantime, though, I would be interested in hearing what you guys think about my response to this documentary, this propaganda video, and whether or not you want me to continue with the video, because honestly, it only gets worse from here. This video only used 12 minutes and 9 seconds of Steve Anderson's video that he posted. And there are 54 minutes total, I think. So let me know whether you want me to continue on through or go ahead and move on to other topics. It's really up to you and how you guys respond to this video. If anyone can do the math for me on what groups are how many times more likely than others to get HIV or AIDS, that would also be very helpful. Please be sure to comment, like, rate, subscribe, and share. You can also find me on Facebook, and I do have a blog, though I haven't written in it in about a month, but I plan to change that soon. So in the meantime, I hope you guys are having a fantastic beginning to your new year, and I will see you all again soon.